Okay. So hey guys, today we have Harsh. He is a Google Summer Report organization admin at Moja Global and a open source engineer at Localstack. He is a passionate open source contributor and was a previous Google Summer Report student and a Google Season of Docs technical writer and an outreach mentor. I know Harsh from last year when we participated in GSoC together. Harsh is someone who I really find insightful. So Harsh, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me to this podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you for joining the podcast as our guest. It's really nice to have you here.
Yep.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Definitely. So, hi everyone. My name is Harsh. Currently, I'm working at Localstack as an open source engineer. For folks who don't know about Localstack, it's an open source company that is basically developing cloud service emulation for Amazon Web Services. So it simply means you can try running the AWS services pretty much locally inside a Docker container. And I'm basically contributing to the overall development of the product and the open source project that is associated with it. I'm also the technical community lead at Moja Global. Moja Global is a collaboration under the Linux Foundation where we are developing climate change tools so that we can effectively track greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're like trying to get started into open source contribution and anything of that sort, you can just reach out to me over Moja Global and you can get started with your contributions. As Sunit mentioned, I previously has been a Google Summer of Code student developer and a Google Season of Docs technical writer. And yeah, that's pretty much about me.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, so Harsh, can you tell us about your background, like how you started coding, how you got to know about software engineering and all?
Sure. So I guess my journey had started back in my school time. So for people who are aware about it, so like ICC board has a very strong curriculum around computer science. So I was a part of the ICC board, and my first introduction to programming was back in class four. So we were given a course on
Yeah.
Logo. So Logo was kind of a sort of a visual programming language, I suppose. And
Mm.
we were supposed to like make some shapes with it and all of those things. So just to tell you, like I was pretty terrible at it. Like programming was something that made absolutely no sense to me, and for most of the time, I just treated it as just another subject that I had to cram and I had to just spit it out in the exam. My reality check came around class six, so by that time I had already learned about Logo, about QBasic, and some HTML. But now my time was to actually deal with a real programming language. So this is where I got introduced to C++. And for a lot of the people who have worked with C++ before,
Yeah.
you must know that it's a complex language for beginners. So the initial few months were quite okayish, but once I had to develop some algorithms of my own and all of those things, I simply failed at it because I was not able to grasp on how should I
Mm.
exactly code. So right now I understand that programming is sort of like programming and mathematics are sort of like two sides of the same coin. But back then it was like, I just have to know these C++ concepts, the algorithms, and all of these things. They don't matter to me a lot. And that's the reason why I failed my C++ examinations almost twice or thrice uh, on a row. And I pretty much gave up that I will absolutely like do no good in C++. So it was at this time when I was thinking like, okay, let's drop this whole like curriculum itself. Let's maybe move to something like CBSE or state board where I can at least leave this whole field of computer programming. But it was at this time when I simply managed to pass in my C++, maybe because my teacher was quite like in Hindi we say rehem dil. So he was like quite okay on me. So like, okay, let him pass and see what he does. And in my next year, I got introduced to Java. So this time I did not make the same mistake. I went to my library. I started like learning about Java, object-oriented programming. And this is where some other teachers helped me started developing some algorithmic understanding that, okay, if you want to find the prime numbers in this range, this is how you should be devising an algorithm. This is how you should use a math skill to actually do that. And this is when both my computing skills and my mathematics skills basically improved quite drastically. So by the end of my class 10th, I was one of the top scorers in the computer science subject. And I also managed to win a district level hackathon by that time. So again, 11 and 12, like these were the quota times. People simply leave
Mm,
out all of their dreams and they just go to Kota to prepare for JEE. So I
mm,
did the same. I went to Kota, and it was a bad decision, I suppose, because I completely left programming and I was not able to do good in physics, chemistry, or maths altogether. Uh, so again, I landed myself into a college. It was not that great, but I suppose like it provided a lot of academic support because I had to do a ton of other things, and my teachers and my faculty were pretty okay with it. So again, first year, starting with the basics, C, C++, data structures, algorithms. This time I had no fear about it. So I just went through all the subjects, and then I decided to like study more about Python, JavaScript, a bit of a Golang. But
mm,
initial love was found in Python itself. So that's exactly how I got started with the programming. My engineering understanding started to develop in my second semester. Like this is when I had studied some subjects like operating system, Linux, computer networks, and I started to appreciate that how these algorithms that I'm studying are basically shaping these kind of software as well. So that's
mm.
like how it all got started up.
Yeah, that's really nice story. And you had programming in your curriculum in class 4
Yeah.
and C++ in 6.
Yeah. This is
That's
something that I empathize with a lot of folks. So even in my
mm,
own college, a lot of people joined computer science thinking that it's a field where they can easily make a good cut, but they simply sucked at coding. And I understand why that is happening because people just take it as a subject and they don't try to think of it from an engineering perspective. So that's the reason why a lot of people basically struggle in coding for the first couple of years whenever they are starting
mm,
up. And they essentially found a love once they are well settled in, once they understand the whole nature of this whole subject, and then they are able to do quite good as well.
yeah. The
Yeah.
curriculum, if we can
Mhm.
give them some time, they will mature with the
Yep.
subject. And by the way, have you ever thought of in your early college days, have you ever thought of getting into the competitive coding side?
Yep.
Ever make
So yeah,
yeah.
so I was originally a competitive programmer. So I was one of the
Mm,
highest rated competitive coders from my college. I was only beaten by one
yeah.
of my seniors, who currently works at Oracle right now. But I was pretty consistent at it, and I participated in most of the competitive programming contests. The real break, like for my love of competitive programming, came once I got introduced to open source and development. So I was like more
Mm,
fascinated about developing some real world apps rather than just solving some questions and like
yeah.
those kind of things. And it made more sense to me like actually follow that path instead of just sticking with competitive coding. I did not
Mm,
completely leave that field. I just simply switched my focus to doing hardcore competitive programming to just doing normal lead code and all of those things so that I can at least crack those kind of interviews when I'm expected to. So I would dare say
mm,
that I didn't find a lot of utility of competitive programming or lead code in my career till now. Maybe in the
mm,
future, if I'm like looking for more DSA heavy roles or interviews, maybe
yeah.
maybe I would have to go and tread on that same path. But as of now, it's all fine.
Most of the senior engineers write the same in Twitter that we don't never have to implement this in our.
Yeah, so you don't have to implement these DSA and stuff, but there are various other aspect of like DSA where you might encounter them in some or the other time. And it's
Mm,
pretty legitimate. If I can take an example, I was recently working at HackerRank. So over at HackerRank, I was part of the editors team, and over there we were trying to implement some functionality with how the terminal opens in our IDE. So one of the person who was using that ID, like they reported a bug that the terminal screen is actually being overlapped. So due to this, whatever
mm,
like things that we are doing on the terminal, like it is not exactly being shown, and it is overridden by some previous value. So once we
mm,
started digging deep inside the code of how we actually implemented it, so since we were using an external library, we found out the bug, and the bug was actually a misrepresentation of the like binary tree data structure.
yeah.
So they had this underlying structure available, and what we
Mm,
just had to do is like tweak this on our side, create a patch so that every time we are like building that application, we apply this patch, and the terminal got fixed. This was just one example. Another example is for my CI/CD work at SciPy. So over at SciPy,
mm,
I was trying to migrate their entire CI/CD pipelines from setup tools to Meson, and we wanted to make it in such a way that every time there is a code change, We just build only that particular piece of code. So
Mhm.
like if we're trying to build an application, most of the times what the build tools do is like they build the application from scratch. This is what most of the tools like setup tools or npm or something else will essentially do. Meson,
Mhm.
on the other hand, will only build that piece of code which has been changed. And how does Meson do
Mhm.
that? They have something that is called as directed acyclic graph. So
Mhm.
a lot of people who have studied graph algorithms, they might know this concept and they might be familiar with it. So there are a lot of these real world utilities. The good part about software engineering is that they have been abstracted so much level upon level that we essentially don't have to worry about it.
Mhm.
So that's the reason why you see that in the industry we have junior engineers, we have senior engineers, we have tech leads. Junior engineers will always think on a feature specificity. They will just think that whatever is being assigned to me, I just need to get it done as fast as
Mhm.
possible, as simplistic as possible. Senior engineers, they will always think to abstract things up. So whatever they are getting, just abstract it so that it's easy for the others to basically work on. Like at HackerRank, we
Mhm.
were building IDs for different languages. Building
Yeah.
ID for a single language was a complex thing, but one of the senior engineers created a whole framework on this. So it is like you just use a framework and you can build an ID of your own. So
Okay.
it literally, like one of my co-interns literally took just a
Hmm.
day or two to build an entire Solidity ID for interviewing candidates who are good in Web3. So this is what like senior engineers can think on. But coming to lead engineers,
Mhm.
they think upon business specificity, like what are the things that we should be doing on the engineering side of things that can
Mhm.
contribute to the overall business. Because at the end of the day, everything that we're doing is getting us business outcome.
Yeah.
So there are some utilities. We just like need to find those underlying patterns here and there.
Yeah, in some cases, the algorithms is must
Mhm.
like you are working on a search algorithm. You need to optimize it, and you don't know the algorithm. So, and in some
Definitely.
cases, just for optimizing the application performance, if you know the
Mhm.
best way to best data
Yes.
structures, then it will help.
Mhm. Definitely. So that's the reason why a lot of big tech companies focus upon data structure algorithms, because the best utility that they are trying to get out of like their hiring process is that they need people who can think on how better we can optimize the system, like how better we
Yeah.
can optimize our technical depth or our infrastructure and all those kind of things. So it is totally legitimate for them to hire on the basis of DSA. But for
Mm.
companies who are still building right now, who still have to reach the point where the tech is saturated, it is still very,
Mm.
very far away from like actually using DSA as a metric to hire
Yeah.
people for their company.
That's why most of the people in LinkedIn these days write that we don't see DSAs. Please apply to our company.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's a good hack for them, like to get a huge pool of candidates who don't like DSA. But again, they would have to deal with their own like hiring depth when they have to actually pick up
Mm.
those people who are really good at the things that they do. So
Yeah, they have their own problems.
yeah,
So, talking about startups, so you are right now working in a startup, Localstack. So, how is it to work in a startup? Can you tell us about your work culture and what is the current thing that you are working on in Localstack?
definitely. So, one of the things that I particularly like is working at startups. So again, everyone has their own views about it. Some people they prefer to go to big tech because it not only gets them their tag and the brand name, but it also gets them a good
Mm.
compensation. Startups, they were particularly synonymous with struggle at one point of time. It is like if you're joining a startup,
Yeah.
you would have to struggle in the initial stage. You might end up not being paid, or you might end up
Yeah.
working long hours and all of these kind of things. It is particularly true to an extent because whatever Indian startups that I have seen, and I have like met a lot of people who have been working in Indian startups, they had a particularly hard time at some and a particularly enjoyable time at others. It completely depends upon the team that you're working with, the kind of manager you have, and the kind of the work that you're putting in. So if you're
Yeah.
like joining an early stage Indian startup, you will obviously notice that the work hours are long, you might end up being underpaid, and you will always feel kind of like unappreciated sometimes. You are like, I just deploy
Mm.
this feature and like no one cares about it. Everyone is busy with the business outcomes.
Next feature. Mm.
Yeah. So now there are some Indian startups that are just revolutionizing the scene. Like one of the threads that I saw today was from Dukan's CTO. So for
Yeah.
people who don't know what Dukan is, then It's basically like a retail store kind of application. So if you're like trying to build an online business, you can just use Dukan. If you have already used or seen Shopify websites before,
Mm.
Dukan is bringing a global alternative for that and in a much better state. Now, a lot of the people who are working at Dukan, like they were literally hired at a lightning speed. Like I saw that one of the interns was hired literally within 10 minutes because his internship project, like the project that he used for his internship pitch was that good. So Dukans, like a lot of people who are working at Dukan, they have literally said that they enjoy good working culture, good compensation, good work-life balance and everything. So there are a lot of Indian companies that are providing you all amenities of life as possible. Now, there is a stark difference between Indian startups and the startups in the West. Uh, like if I personally talk about European startups, personally worked at two European startups. One was a Web3 one called as Nethermind. It is based in London. The next one is Localstack, which is based in Zurich. And one of the things that I have particularly noticed is a huge emphasis upon work-life balance. It is like whatever
Mm.
you're doing, whatever you're working on, you should at the end of the day make sure that your work-life balance is well maintained. We don't care like how urgent the work is or like how critical the work is. You should at least like log off once you have completed your given time period over this place, and you should take some time out for your family and everything. So this is one of the best parts about it, and your managers will personally try to convince you to take some like day off or maybe take some vacation once they think like you have overworked yourself. This is also like quite different from US based startups because they are sometimes even more notorious than Indian startups in
Yeah.
terms of like work life balance and all of those kind of things. So again, like the hiring pool for European startups is literally competitive. There are various places where you can find relevant opportunities. There is Angel List, there is Hacker News, there is Twitter, and all of these things. And they're particularly picky about selecting the right candidates. But if you happen to be one of those
Another
candidates,
website that I want to add is Work at Startup by Y
yeah,
Combinator. So you can find all of the
cool,
great
cool.
startups.
Yeah, that sounds cool. So over at Localstack, right now I'm working on your core cloud emulation. So as I said before, Localstack enables you to run these AWS services locally. So Localstack has a lot of untapped potential, both on code side and the community side. So I'm just working on like these kind of things. So maybe just think of it as a generalist role. But at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that local stack is much better for people like who are exactly leveraging it. So right now we have over 10,000 plus users distributed across Fortune 500 companies, startups, individual folks, and more of them. So just supporting local stack for all of these kind of people altogether and just making it a much better platform at the end of the day.
Yeah, you were talking about local stack and the concept behind it. I mean,
Hmm.
um, whole development cycle and all of the testing things. You can
Yep.
of AWS, you can locally do it,
Hmm.
which will save lot
Yep.
of your cost.
Hmm.
The concept is for me it looks really product market fit,
Yep.
and this is really insightful, and there should be some solution for this problem. This is a true
Yep.
problem.
That's the reason why even before Localstack was created as a company, like it's a fun fact. Even before Localstack was created as a company, we had the first few thousand users. We didn't even have to do like
Mm,
some sort of marketing, or we didn't have to do like some
yeah.
sort of social outreach. And this is something that can also inspire a lot of other open source projects who are trying to develop
Mm,
their own business out of it. Is that like if you have a good open source project and you want to like get it to the next level, like make it your own company or make it your own business, you don't have to
mm.
wait for long. You can just like try to monetize it. You can try to create an enterprise application on top of it. And if Localstack happens to succeed, like this would be a textbook definition of success for open source projects altogether.
Yeah, these days there are so many open source startups and big
Hmm.
companies, I would say. Even
Yep.
Docker is a YC startup, and they are
Hmm.
doing some great stuff. I've been
Yep.
now Docker is all over the place.
Yep. So I
So
guess like as of today, if you are like developing your product in open source, like I'm not exactly sure what Y Combinator people are thinking, but I've seen this trend for some time. So I was in touch with one of the companies that got selected into Y Combinator even before they actually got selected. So this company is like a one-man show. Like there is a single person, like he is ex Palantir Technologies.
uh,
So he created this whole product that is like automating your workflows by using scripts that are deployed on cloud. So you can just write a script. That platform will
mm,
convert this into an API, and you can connect it with Slack, with your individual cloud accounts, and all of those things to automate some mundane stuff. And
mm,
this company got funded by Y Combinator. So I was
uh,
pretty shocked about it. It's like, okay, you don't have a business plan right now.
mm,
Your hosted application is literally on a very temporary server. We don't even know like
mm,
if it can handle 100 users, and you just
uh,
have one single person inside your company.
mm,
So how come they got funded? But like
mm,
I guess like that answer remains a mystery till now. But over the time, I have seen that Y Combinator has started putting up a lot of focus on open source. So there are a lot
mm,
of open source projects that are coming up that are getting funded by Y Combinator. So it seems like not just that company, but there are companies like Signos, Super Tokens, and a lot of the
mm,
others who are entirely open source, and they are like getting massive funding, and they are like completely developing on open source itself. So this is a cue that open source market is exploding right now, and it is very easy right now to attract like some lucrative funding if you're like completely developing on open source.
Yeah, basically what they do is open source projects, the open core model that you have a
Mhm.
basic product which is free for
Yep.
everyone,
Yep.
and this will be a enterprise product.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, if you can run it for free, take it for free. It's
Yeah.
completely up to you. If you need some support, create a GitHub issue. We will take care of
Mm,
that. But beyond that, just pay us $15 a month so that we can take care of your issues. So
yeah,
this is something that less people have to complain about.
yeah. That's, I think, a good thing because they should sustain their self and in some way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep, definitely.
So, you are a GSoC org admin yourself, and
Yep.
what would be your advice for students who want to participate in open source programs like GSoC,
Yep.
GSoD, Outreachy, and open source in general?
So I will give the most like radical and the most to the point advice. Don't be pretentious. So if you are joining an open source community and you have on the back of your mind that yes, I want to participate in Google Summer of Code or Google Season of Docs,
Mm,
please don't come to us and say like, hey, I'm an open source contributor, because you're not.
mm,
You're like trying to come through an open source program.
okay.
Because if you'd be a good open source contributor, you might have noticed us like much before itself. You might not have waited
Mm,
for our GSoC applications to be opened or GSoD applications to get open and
oh,
all of these kind of things.
yeah.
So I had a lot of experience with these kind of people. It is like
Mm,
they will be part of your community for a long time. They will
mm,
not interact. They will not message anything. They will not participate in any of the calls. Once the
mm,
applications are open, they will just simply come to us and they will say like, "Hey, I want to contribute." So we cannot say anything to them because as a community lead, we need to be as empathetic with people as possible. But since this is a podcast, I can actually tell my real
yeah, yeah,
feelings.
sure.
Yeah. So that's the thing. Like, if you have this on back of your mind, just say it honestly. We will try
Mm,
to like. It won't come to us in a negative way. Rather, it can just
mm,
come to us like in a positive manner because we know that under what terms and conditions you will engage with us. Because
yeah.
sometimes when we are mentoring a candidate, we are helping them prepare a proposal and these kind of things. We should exactly understand that what is the commitment that this particular candidate is bringing forward. So I remember like working with a candidate for helping them submit their GSoC proposal, and it was like
Mm.
you just need my help with the proposal part. They are not ready to contribute something else to the project. So it is
Oh,
like
you
before,
told this in our group.
yeah.
Yeah.
So before GSoC, you are supposed to like contribute something so that we can know your skills. And it was like, no, like this is a part of my project. I will do it once I get selected. This won't come like very positively to us because with GSoC, GSoD outreach, and like any kind of mentorship program, we are trying to actively groom candidates,
Mm,
prepare them so that once they complete their project, they can stick with us for a long period of time. Because if you're just leaving after your project gets complete, it means no
mm,
net value for us. Because then the whole community will start falling around and no one will be there to support each other.
yeah.
So if you're coming into a community, come with a like clear slate. Let us know what your expectations are, what are the things that you're aiming for, Because at the end of the day, as an open source maintainer, we want you to be compensated for the work. No matter what kind of work you do, we want you to be compensated for it. And the reason why
Mm.
these mentorship programs exist is to basically help you match with these kind of
Mm.
opportunities itself. So
For
just let us
long
know about
time
it. Yeah,
contributors. Yeah.
exactly. So for short-term contributors, we can find these like GSoC, GSoD, and all of these things. But let me tell you, there are much greater things that you might not even hear
Yeah.
about for long-term contributors. So like come for these programs, stay for the community at the end of the day, and you will see what other things that is coming around.
Yeah. I mean, there's no loss in contributing to open source because every contribution will be on the Git. You can always
Yeah.
showcase it. People will always find your profile and see this, and
Mhm.
recruiters will reach out to you. And there's no loss in contributing to.
Yeah. People just find loss in time because for some people, like time is the most precious and the most essential thing. So it is like I should be spending my time at things that are really precious, and that's something what I can get a output from. But again, it should be just okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Open source contribution shouldn't be that much of a wastage of time. It's-
So it is like even for like a normal college sophomore or a junior, like who is coming to a really
yeah,
large project, going
yeah,
through the docs, going through the issues, introducing themselves in the community, like it's a real investment.
yeah.
It totally depends upon you, like whether you consider this as a right investment or a wrong one. Sometimes
Mm,
it goes either way, depending upon how community perceives your contribution. So at the end of the day, just choose what's best for you. So
yeah.
yeah.
What I suggest is going through really easy projects, not organizations, projects.
Mhm.
Like if you know Android development, there's a organization called FOSS here. They have really easy Android projects. You can always contribute to them, and
Mhm.
everyone starts from that organization.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Like for Shassia is synonymous with beginners getting started with open source. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So. So you were a Google Summer of Docs student as well at
Mhm.
Moja Global. Uh,
Mhm.
so can you tell us about the program Google Summer of Docs?
Sure. So it's Google's season of docs, and it is more like towards helping technical writers and documentation developers. Now, when I
Mm,
say people about technical writing, they just think, okay, we need to document the software. So they have this
mm,
feature, we just need to write a doc on it. But let me tell you, documentation development is one of the toughest nuts to crack. I won't compare it with coding because both of them are like different fields, but documentation is literally hard because when you're writing a documentation piece, it's like you just not only need to consider the user, but you also need to consider other aspects of documentation. How does your piece fits well with the other documentation pieces? How accessible
mm,
this documentation piece is for the other users? Like, let us say
mm,
you're writing a documentation piece and you just mention terminal. Now, you're mentioning
mm.
terminal. It might make sense to a macOS user. It might make sense to a Linux user. For a
But
Windows user,
Windows, mm,
it will make no sense.
yeah.
So that's the reason why every company which has a good documentation team, like they have this style guides that literally says like how you should be writing the documentation.
Mm,
You will not find style guides for coding and all of these kind of things because we automate this process by linters. But
yeah.
in other companies, documentation writers have to literally refer to style guide while they're writing the documentation, while they're reviewing it, all those kind of things. Like for example, at Red Hat, we had this IBM style guide. This
Mm,
was literally 700 pages long. So even if you're making a very small change, like let's say adding a comma, that style
okay.
guide had particular instructions on what you should be doing and what you should not be doing. So now you can
Uh,
think how hard documentation can get sometimes. And
yeah.
documentation is also something that can make or break your project. So it is like you build a really cool project, people are eager to use it, but you give them a poor documentation. Out of them, like 70% people will just drop off. They will think, okay, documentation is really poor. I cannot even set up this piece of project on my machine. Let me just find some alternative and try to use that. Or even better, let me find a SaaS service whom I can pay
Mm, yeah.
$15 a month, whom I can use that. So if you have bad documentation, no one will even bother to use you at some or the other point of time. So Google Season of Docs as a program was meant to support documentation efforts because sometimes documentation takes even more time compared to coding. And it is really necessary for organizations to get their documentation straight.
Hmm.
Like there are a lot of organizations that are actively working on documentation, accessibility, and all of those kind of things. So it
Yeah.
really gets like hectic sometimes, and that's the reason Google came up with this season of documentation program. So it is pretty new. Like we have just four editions of these programs up till now,
Hmm.
starting from 2019. It like the compensation that is provided in Google season of docs, like it varies from organization to organization. Like some orgs pay around $1,000 for the entire program. Some organizations
Hmm.
pay around $3,000 to $6,000 for the entire program. While
Hmm.
some organizations might hire just a single writer and they will pay the entire amount to them, like 10,000 to 15,000 US dollars.
This
So
year, someone got 15,000, I think.
yeah, so it is for an organization called as Simpai. So
Yeah.
I know the maintainer who like hired that person. His name is Aaron. The reason they hired
Hmm.
that person is because that person has already been working with Simpai for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they didn't make any
Long-term contributor benefits. Here you can
yes,
see.
yeah, they didn't make any applications and all. Like a lot of people
Hmm.
approached them, like asking them to be considered, but they were like, "We have already selected someone before we even got selected. We can't do anything right now." So
Yeah.
yeah. So most of the
That's.
times you can expect to be paid around 5,000 to 6,000 US dollars, and that's a pretty
Hmm.
decent amount for 6 months of work.
Hmm.
Depending on the context that you're working, almost part time, like 15 to 20
Hmm.
hours per week. So that's already a good amount.
So, how is the work there? There will be a mentor who will be assigning work to you, and you will just report your
Yeah.
progress.
So compared to GSoC, like even this time, like GSoC has completely removed uh, the limits for students. So it is like
Mm.
professionals can also participate. GSoD
Yeah.
doesn't consider someone as a student or a professional. They are like,
Mm.
we don't need those kind of details. We just need the names
Mm.
and the email addresses of the technical writers that you selected.
Mm.
So they just don't care about it. They just don't care like who you are. Like, are you a student? Are you a professional? That simply doesn't matter to them. And GSoT has removed the option of mentoring someone. So it is like you cannot have a mentor for a particular project on the official terms.
Mm.
Unofficially, every organization might give a mentor or a guide to the particular contributor. But over in the GSoD application, they will not ask like who is mentoring your GSoD like participants. So it is
Mm.
a completely decentralized process. It might make less sense for people who are participating in GSoC to get into
Yeah.
GSoC and all of those things. But at the end of the day, GSoC basically asks us to hire the best of the best. So it is
Mm.
also plausible for us to like hire someone who has a good amount of experience in technical writing, someone who might be a bit senior, so that they can steer the work, they can progress the work in a much better manner compared to someone who is
Mm.
just a student. So
Oh.
yeah,
So, it is a bit different than this. So
yes,
then,
GSoC
just
is
the
decentralized. Yeah,
just the name is similar.
yep. So GSoC is decentralized. It is like up to the organizations whom they want to select.
Mm.
Some organizations might select someone who is in their school time. Some
Mm.
organizations might select someone who might have 10 years of experience. Completely
Mm.
depends on them.
Yeah, it's more open, I would say.
Yeah,
Then,
yeah, and more competitive as well. So
yeah,
yeah,
from open is also completely.
yeah, definitely.
So you do have a good amount of experience in technical writing, and
Mhm.
so do you have any advice for people who are getting started at technical writing? As you said, technical writing is really important, and even
Mhm.
from the business point of view, most some SaaS companies who are providing APIs and multiple companies are providing APIs, and if you don't have documentations, it's more
Yep,
likely that developers aren't going to use your services. And
definitely.
in even in open source, we face this every day that there is a very great project, but they don't have any documentation. No one can understand that amount of code, so we ignore
Mhm.
that. So what would
Yeah.
be your advice for someone getting started?
So if you're trying to get started with technical writing, try to find what is your particular niche over there. Niche in
Hmm.
the sense like, do you like more of creative writing? This is what people do with blog writing, creating Twitter threads, and all of those things. People are
Hmm. Hmm.
literally earning a lot and being successful by just writing Twitter threads. So
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
see that there is a lot of potential over there as well. So is it
Yeah.
that the creative writing interests you, or do you want the plain old documentation writing that has a business outcome. This is where you write documentation for other software, APIs, and all of those kind of things. Or
Hmm.
are you interested in documentation engineering? This is a separate field altogether, which combines both aspects of things. Like you might be doing some part of coding as well, you might be doing some part of technical writing as well. Like let us say you have to construct a completely new docs engine for a particular project.
Hmm.
So, for example, just go and check out Google Cloud documentation. You will notice that in the Google Cloud documentation, you can actually run those commands that they mention on the documentation
Hmm.
itself and
Yeah.
see like what their output is.
Hmm.
This is not the work of normal technical writers. This is where people who have a good expertise in docs engines basically come in. So
Even
if I
Flutter documentation has a better what you
yeah,
just said example of this.
yes. So like if I talk about my own self, like I specialize in this particular field, like creating docs engines. So there are a lot of
Mm.
frameworks on this. There is Dockersaurus, there is Jekyll, there is Yugo, there is MKDocs, and more of these things. And architecting like a complete documentation engine like creates a like needs a lot of efforts. You will need to think like where should you be placing the whole documentation, where you should be placing the reference guide, what kind of framework you will be following. Like even in documentation we have frameworks like Access framework. This is what we use to basically characterize blogs, reference guides, supplementary materials, and more of these things. So
Mm.
try to find what your niche is in and just to get started with it. Even in Google Season of Docs, you will find work that is around all of these kind of things. Some projects might need some creative writing skills. Some projects just need some good old documentation skills. Some project might
Mm.
ask you to build a completely new docs engine, like a new website or a new platform where they can publish the documentation and those kind of stuff. So, yeah.
That's that's a lot of information. So,
Yeah.
Harsh, how do they operate? I think who is in charge of the whole documentation?
Mhm.
Is he someone who is also a part of the API building process or SDK building process, or he's someone uh, just separately works just separately on the documentation?
Most of the times, they would be people who are overlapping with both code and documentation. So
Hmm.
in some companies, like you will also find them under the software engineering teams itself. So
Hmm.
they work with the technical writers in getting the necessary content, and
Hmm.
then basically use their engineering skills to basically architect the whole thing. In most of the places where I have seen, like people literally collaborate using a CMS, which is like a content management system. So there are various content management system out there. Like there is Storyblock, there is Forestry, there is
Hmm.
Ghost, and these kind of things. So they will construct these whole things, and they will allow the technical writers to basically contribute the content while they take care of the accessibility, the functionality, and placing the documentation at the right place so that it makes the best sense to the user. So
Hmm.
technical writing is a field where you need to have the technical expertise, as the very name suggests. So it takes some
Hmm.
effort, but once you make sense out of it, it is literally easy. So just pick up a
Hmm.
large project for context and just try to see on how the documentation is structured. One of the best projects that I can think of is the GitHub Docs. This is like I guess
Yeah.
Sunit, you are the GitHub campus expert.
Yeah,
So
will
yeah,
become the later on also
yeah, a
sometime.
field expert as well. So in
Yeah.
case of field expert, you might get a chance to contribute to the documentation. So
Okay.
you will exactly see how GitHub Docs are structured and how
Mm,
it contributes to the overall experience around GitHub. Because even though
mm,
GitHub is a platform which needs no documentation because everything is so intuitive, but
mhm,
whenever we find for something like how much is a CI build job costing us, GitHub
mm,
documentation will have an answer for that. So it is one of the best reference that you can take to build a really nice documentation.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really nice. From my point of view, the documentation part is one thing that I'm really focusing on these days, because most of the
Mhm.
as I'm working on a crypto startup, and most of
Yeah.
the crypto companies are really composable and wants others to build on top of them.
Yeah.
So if you want someone to build on top of them, you have to you have to have a system of onboarding them, which is the documentation.
Yeah.
So right now, most of the companies are really
Mhm.
simply handling this, as there is not much competition. They just use the Git book or that kind of software, and
Yeah.
just very easy. But
Definitely.
later it will get really tough, like a Flutter type documentation. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
So, um, so you are also in Moja Global and you are really active in the Moja Global community.
Yeah,
So, can you tell us about Moja Global and its initiative for supporting ambitious climate actions and how someone can get involved in it?
definitely. So as I mentioned before, Moja Global is an initiative under the Linux Foundation. And Moja Global, like a lot of people have this misconception that Moja Global is something that has been created in either Australia or Canada, because a lot of the people who are working with us are from these two countries. But
Mm,
contrary to that, Moja Global has originally been created in Kenya. So it's actually a Swahili word, Moja Global. I don't remember the exact meaning of it, but the entire purpose was to work on like building climate change software and all of these things. So a lot of the people might know about United Nations, like they have some differing views on it. So United
mm,
Nations has this particular platform called as Framework for Climate Change Convention. We just call it UNFCCC. So UNFCCC basically created some guidelines that we call as the IPCC guidelines, and this is something that we follow
mm,
for all sort of carbon measurement and carbon modeling and those kind of stuff. So one of the things that the guidelines have mentioned is that we need to create a measurement, reporting, and verification framework, basically
mm,
called as an MRV framework. So all of the governments across the world, all of the different institutions and organizations, they need to have an MRV framework so that they can track these greenhouse gas emissions. So let
mm,
us say we are on this land right now. So from this land itself, there is a lot of greenhouse gas emissions happening. It can happen from the soil, it can happen from the leaves, it can happen from the like the bark of the trees that is just shutting down. So greenhouse gas
mm,
emissions can happen from all of these, and we need a reliable way to measure and report that, and also verify
mm,
it with all sort of government data. So this is where the people like the engineers who were working with Moja Global, who had almost 15 years of expertise building MRVs, they created something called as a flint. The Flint stands for Full Land Integration Tool. And the best part about Flint is that it's a framework which can combine multiple data sources. It can combine satellite images, it can combine sensor data, it can combine on field data and all of those kind of things. And it can give you a time series database that says, like, okay,
mm,
this is how the carbon emissions has been happening in this particular area over the time. It can be 5 years, it can be 10 years, it can be 15 years, and it will give
mm,
enough reliable data to the end user so that they can prepare a report out of it and they can just go to the government or their organization and say, like, okay, this is how much carbon emission is happening in this area, and these are the kind of measures that we should be taking. So Flint is not exactly a black box, but some of the things that we have done in Flint is literally magical, and I guess it's totally on the expertise of the engineers who worked on it. So after we developed Flint, a lot of countries started building their own implementations on top of it. Like Kenya built its implementation called as Sleek. Canada built its own implementation called as GCBM. Now
mm,
GCBM is used by even Belize, Colombia, Chile, and all of these
mm,
countries as well. Even in countries like India, Pakistan, we are trying to bring Moja Global as well. Like I'm also
mm,
talking with the Forest Survey of India on trying to demonstrate Moja Global's plant in states like Uttarakhand and Kerala. So this is an
mm,
ambitious project, and
yeah,
we also like presented the whole Moja Global suite of software and services last year at United Nations. We might do it again this year as well. So it's a huge thing that we are doing, and it overall has a very high net impact as well. On the
mm,
contributor side of things, on the open source side of things, we have tons of projects. These projects are
mm,
around Python, JavaScript. Some of them are also in Java, Docker, infrastructure, and all of those things. Right now, our focus is upon Flint UI and Flint Cloud. So Flint is
mm,
a framework, like it's a simple CLI tool that we can use.
mm,
We have extended this in form of a REST API, which is the Flint Cloud, and we are basically
yeah,
consuming those backend APIs in Flint UI. So if you have experience with Python, Flask,
mm,
Vue.js, Docker, and all of those kind of things, just reach out to us and we will find ways for you to get started with our community and projects.
yeah. So that sounds really interesting. So I'm curious that how they get the inputs, like how they get the right amount of inputs to calculate the carbon
Yeah.
emissions.
So that's the thing. It's like Flint, essentially, like on the input layer, it can combine any sort of input and it can compute it intelligently so that it can make some sense out of it. So it can work with the minimum amount of input as well. Like let us say you are in a particular area, you don't have
mm,
any inputs for it.
mm,
What Flint can do is like it can literally use the geographical data for the
mm,
past few years, and it can try to compute the things based upon equivalent data sets from different regions.
mm,
So it combines all of these data sources together. It
mm,
formats them into its own data structure, and then it basically
mm,
computes so that it can create a time series database. So that's internally like how Flint works. It is something that even I have a lot of difficulty
mm,
making sense out of it, but that's the most
mm.
simplistic explanation that I can provide.
So it takes information from some global APIs providing
Yeah,
that.
satellite
Data.
satellite images,
Mm,
remote sensing data, land sensor data,
mm,
even government sources as well, because government is like tracking all of these things all together, but they don't
mm,
have the right tools and the right software to basically measure this. So this is where
mm.
Flint basically comes in.
Yeah, that's the right use of data.
Yeah.
So so that's was it. And do you have any advice for people who wants to get started at open source?
Follow
Maybe in
Sunit Roy.
college. Yeah.
Follow Sunit Roy and subscribe to his YouTube channel. That's the first thing. Like I was one of your early subscribers, and even
Yeah.
though I have no interest in Android, I have at least tried to see like a few of your YouTube videos. So just follow him and like know like just see like what kind of things that he's doing, and if he can do it, like everyone else can. Like he's one of the inspirations for a lot of young people as of now. Like I simply cannot fathom that when I was having a talk with him before this particular podcast, he was saying that he's in his first year of college right now. And I was like, okay, if I would have been at his level in my first year, I could have done a ton of other things as well. And just a fun fact, like he has also created his own crypto application, like his own first product. This is something that I'm still very far away from doing. So it boggles my mind. So yeah.
So that's a lot. I mean, that's a big thing that you said. Personally, I find Harsh really insightful and someone who I really look up to because he have I even before talking with Harsh, first I saw him in YouTube. He was one of the first guys to be the MLH fellow. So I was searching, and there was only a Harsh video. So when we talked in first, when we talked in WhatsApp, so Harsh said, "Do you know me?" I said that I have watched you in a video.
Very good. That is cool. But yeah, I guess like one of the last advices that I would suggest is try to focus on your own path. Don't get swayed by what people say. Everyone is here to like build their own journey altogether. So
Hmm.
it is not, you should not ever get in a race of Fang or open source or competitive coding or something else. Just focus on what you want to do and what you want to achieve, and eventually you will find a path where you can achieve all your dreams. So just work on that and remember that no amount of shortcuts can get you to your goal. At the end of the day, you have to put in a lot of hard work. So yeah.
Yeah, and you are only in race with yourself.
Yeah.
You don't have to prove it to anyone. If you are happy, you are doing well enough for yourself, and that's
Mhm.
okay.
Yep.
So that's it. Hope you have liked the podcast. We will bring Harsh hopefully again to the podcast.
Yeah.
So do like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video.